The country is in a total mess, and that's putting it mildly. We're squeezing living standards since the Napoleonic era, the NHS falling apart, and that's with an ageing population putting ever more pressure on it, as well as the crisis of social care, local authorities on their knees and going bankrupt, infrastructure quite literally falling apart, an epic housing crisis, schools not given the funding and resources they need after the damage inflicted by 9% real terms cut in spending in the 2010s, and getting for over 2 decades now of terrible economic growth, itself badly distributed. And yet, it is boom time, of course, for the well-off, with UK billionaires having enjoyed a 1,000 increase in their wealth over 3 decades. It is quite literally all right for some. Now, this is an extraordinarily wealthy country. It really is. The problem is that wealth gets locked into the bank accounts of a tiny few, and that wealth is created collectively by the hard graft of millions and millions of people. At the same time, the country crumbles, and those very millions who create the wealth struggle to make ends meet. Now, we know what is called austerity, these slash and burn cuts, failing to invest. That failed on its own terms. And as we've established, that has been a disaster for living standards, for growth, and for public services. Yet the Tories are doubling down on this terrible failed experiment. Well, I say failed experiment. It's been pretty good, hasn't it, for the people who fund them? In Jeremy Hunt's latest scorched earth budget, so-called unprotected government departments will suffer a 13% real terms cut in their budgets from the financial years 2025-26 to 2028-29. That's a catastrophic £19 billion cut and means the return of David Cameron and George Osborne-style austerity. So enter stage left. Hopefully Labour, knights in shining armour, little supermen, to sort this mess out. Now, based on Keir Starmer's leadership campaign, which had nothing to worry about, he did, of course, commit to hiking taxes on the well-to-do, making clear there would never be a return to austerity because it had failed, and therefore we could have the investment that a wealthy country should expect to make sure we have sustained rising living standards, solid growth that's evenly distributed, and world-class public services. Bad news, guys. Now, Labour did have one flagship policy to distinguish themselves, a £28 billion a year green investment fund to tackle the climate emergency, but crucially get us the growth we need and well-paid secure jobs, not least in those communities devastated by Thatcherism, which never recovered. And then they trashed that one flagship policy. So what have they got left? They've even committed to the 2-child benefit cap, which does more than any other policy to drive kids further into either into poverty or further into poverty. And if Labour supports policies which drive kids into hardship, you are well entitled to ask, what is the point? Anyway, most journalists have let them get away with this, so it has been refreshing to finally hear Keir Starmer put on the spot. Let's have a little listen to him.
Last week's budget made it very clear that from next year, we're going to see some really savage cuts to public spending. Really savage cuts. And I feel that you haven't really been honest with the British people yet about what you're going to do about that. You know, are you going to tax more, borrow more, or you're going to become, the austerity Prime Minister? What are you going to do?
Let's be honest about what we're going to inherit, because I think it starts there. Because what we learned last week was a terrible indictment on 14 years in power. 14 years of Tory government.
Look, I haven't got long, so I just want to know, we know how bad it is. We know how bad it is. I want you to be honest with people. What are you going to do? Are you going to become the austerity Prime Minister if you win the election?
It'd be an awful inheritance if we're privileged enough to come into power. They've damaged the economy, they've damaged our public services, and we have to change that. I ran a public service, so I don't need anybody to tell me how important it is that our public services are properly supported and properly funded. We have to ensure that we've got an economy that is thriving, because at the bottom of all of this is the fact the economy's been stagnant for 14 years.
I know you want to grow the economy, but that's not going to happen on day one. I want Sheffield Wednesday to win the Premier League. I know it's not going to happen this season.
But there's a lot of things we can do very quickly. The changing the planning regulations and rules can be done very, very quickly.
Councils are going bust.
The National Wealth Fund.
Councils are going bust now.
Yes.
There's a 5.5-year, and I know you'll care about this, there's a 5.5-year average wait from a rape being committed to that person seeing justice. What are you going to do straight away if you're in number 10? Be honest. Are you going to borrow more, or are you going to enact austerity?
Well, where we are going to be able to put money into our public services, we've been clear that we'll do that. So when it comes to the NHS, 2 million reduction in the waiting lists by the scheme that we've got to work 24/7. With our schools,
I'm not talking
getting
about
rid
the initial.
of VAT so that we can put more teachers into our schools desperately needed.
IFS is £20 billion in public services, and you're not being honest about what you're going to do. This is your chance. Tell people.
we need to ensure that the economy is growing. We can turn
It's
that
not
around.
going to happen on day one.
Please, just hear me out
It's
before
not,
telling
though.
me
It's not.
Planning can be changed very, very quickly. That will have a massive impact on growth. The second thing is our National Wealth Fund, which will bring in private investment. I talk to private investors all of the time, and they say to me, Keir, we've got the money to invest right now in your country, but we're not going to do that because we don't see the stability. We don't see the conditions in which we're going to invest. We intend to turn that around. But I'm not going to shy away from your question. We are going to inherit a really badly damaged economy after 14 years of failure. Our job is to pick it up, stand it back up, and move our country forward. And I'm not going to shy away from that or provide easy answers to that.
Or not any answers.
We've got to grow our economy. Now, you may say that's not an answer you like. I say it's the only answer.
It's a long-term answer, but it's not telling me what you're going to do.
Well, I don't think that it is going to take that long to get our economy going. I think we can turn it around very, very quickly. But what I'm not going to do is make the mistake of saying that, or pretending there are easy answers, unfunded spending commitments are what Liz Truss installed on the country, and we're all paying the price. Last week, you saw in that budget, at the very end, staggeringly, the Chancellor announced £46 billion of an unfunded commitment to get rid of national insurance. We're not going to make that mistake. Because in the end, who pays the price for that? It's working people, and I'm not going to allow that to happen under a Labour government.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. There just isn't a plan there, is there? Basically, the hope is private house builders will rescue the country. I mean, that's just not serious, is it? Of course it isn't. The idea it's going to fix the terrible lack of growth and rising living standards baked into our economic model is a joke. And as Sophie Ridge correctly points out, this is at best a long-term aspiration. Let's listen to Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a kind of centrist think tank for centrist economists.
I really do, actually, because, I mean, if you look, I mean, if you take seriously the numbers that I think both Labour and Conservatives are saying that as the baseline for their plans, they involve significant cuts in a whole range of public services, somewhere between justice and social care and local government and the police and so on. Those numbers imply really quite substantial cuts. And of course, no one's talking about that. No one's saying where those cuts would come from, or whether there will be significantly more borrowing, or whether taxes would go up. As ever, there are only three options here, and I think it suits both sides not to really focus on that. I mean, you heard Rachel Reeves just then. I mean, she was not talking about raising taxes to pay for that. She wasn't talking about actually the scale of the challenges which will face public services, because if she talks about that, then she has to admit that those challenges would face her, just as Jeremy Hunt was not willing to talk about what the choices he made this week imply for that for those spending lines.
Now let's also listen to Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves' solution to the Tories stealing Labour's non-dom status policy. Again, one of the few policies that really distinguish them, which would have been used for Labour's NHS and school breakfast plans.
Money comes either from the taxpayer or from borrowing or from spending cuts elsewhere. So what will your overall approach be?
Well, we're going to go through all of the documents as you would expect me to do, and we will identify the savings we can make to fund this.
So that's just Rob Peter to pay Paul. That is austerity. That's what we're looking at here, guys. It's not looking good, is it? New Labour in the 90s came to power at a time of economic growth and rising living standards. It wasn't good enough, New Labour. I can give you a chapter and verse on that. But, that itself was based on an unsustainable economic model that went pop very spectacularly in 2008. But it gave them space to invest in public services. They kept the Tory spending plans for 2 years, but then genuinely did offer public investment, which did make a big difference. It's important to make that point, even if it was undermined by privatisation and marketisation and things like PFI, Private Finance Initiative, which was like paying for public services on a credit card. They also had modest social reforms like the minimum wage, which had an impact and brought the social peace. What do these guys have? They're just offering more austerity, but with a Labour rose stuck to it. They don't actually have anti-poverty measures, unlike New Labour. What's even their version of the minimum wage? So they're offering the same economic model as the Conservatives. What's going to change? How on earth are our public services going to be rebuilt if they're not having a very substantial amount of cash thrown at them, which is what we need, even for things like, dealing with the retention of recruitment crisis in the NHS, because if you take nurses, their real terms pay has gone down by about £5,000 since 2010. As it is, Rachel Reeves has suggested she may cut taxes on the rich. So rather than asking them to pay more money, and let's face it, they'll still be rich if they do, so we can fix the country, Labour talking about bunging them even more dosh at them. What? So they can throw it in a tax haven to offshore, so they can make even more dosh. That's not an alternative. It just means things will stay the same. Well, the model will stay the same, but that means things getting worse. And I fear that will lead to huge anger and disenchantment. And if we don't get our act together, then I fear the far right will. Time to ask some very searching questions, my friends. Please like and subscribe. Do share the video. I'd love to hear your comments on this one. Very important to read your comments on this one. Keep the show on the road at patreon.com/Jose84. Listen to the podcast. Speak to you soon.